House rose in late June and politicians quickly fled Ottawa for the land of photo ops and barbecues. The warm weather, though, didn't stop the government from announcing a summer cabinet shuffle. Some MPs became ministers and others were moved around. Skip ahead to early August. There was that tweet that set off a diplomatic spat with Saudi Arabia and all the retaliations that followed. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh announced he would be running in a yet-to-be-called by-election in Burnaby South. And then, just days before the start of the Conservative Party convention, Maxime Bernier started tweeting about diversity again and again until he actually quit the party.
This party is too intellectually and morally corrupt to be reformed.
He is more interested in advancing his personal profile than advancing conservative principles.
As if things weren't busy enough for the end of summer, throw President Trump in the mix.
They used to call it NAFTA. We're going to call it the United States-Mexico Trade Agreement.
That news of a U.S. and Mexico trade deal sent Canadian officials rushing down to Washington. There were a lot of meetings, but still no deal. And then a decision from the Federal Court of Appeals effectively halting the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion for now. That didn't sit well with the Alberta Premier.
Until the federal government gets its act together, Alberta is pulling out of the federal climate plan.
And that brings us to this week. Notley and Trudeau met to talk pipelines, and the NAFTA talks, well, they continue in Washington.
No NAFTA is better than a bad NAFTA deal for Canadians, and that's what we're going to stay with.
So that's what happened while At Issue was away. Just a few things, but we are back and we've got a few things to talk about. Thankfully, Andrew Coyne, Chantal Hébert, Shachi Kurl, and Paul Wells are all here with me in studio in Toronto. Good to see everybody. Yes. I actually had forgotten there was a cabinet shuffle, so it was one of those kinds of summers. Very busy. We're going to start with NAFTA because it's the issue that's still burning, bubbling, whatever along, and we still don't really know whether the government's going to be able to pull this off. So I'll start with you, Andrew, on this one. Has the government managed this effectively so far? Is there anything else that they should or could be doing?
It's hard to say they've managed it effectively. I think Donald Trump and the views that he represents on alternate Wednesdays would challenge anybody, and his mercurial personality, the people around him, all those things would be challenged to any government, any set of negotiations. But I think you would say it's not like much of what they've done has really helped matters. I think to bringing forward that progressive social agenda, for example, as if that was ever going to have any useful part of these negotiations.
Stuff about women and Indigenous people.
Lovely ideas, but it just was not practical in these talks. I think they've been firmer on some issues that I wish they would yield on. Certainly the retaliatory tariffs, I would say, have not served interest well. You can debate how well they've managed Trump himself. All that being said, we don't know what's going to happen. And if they do manage to pull out of the fire some kind of agreement that is not awful, and I think that's the best we can hope for, is not awful, then they'll look better than they do right now.
We don't know, I think, is the operative sentence. And it's really hard to analyze how we get to somewhere when we don't know if it's nowhere or somewhere, or what is the preferred course. I have yet to meet anyone, and there are many qualified people who have spoken about this file, who have offered me any indication that they could have done a lot better. Yeah. And I give the government credit for so far having managed to not have Canada negotiate with Canada as it negotiates with the United States. And that's an operation that is not easy. When President Trump sent that notice to Congress about the Mexico-U.S. deal on Friday, he got a lot of pushback from unions, from the Chamber of Commerce, from people in Congress. Justin Trudeau did not get a lot of pushback in this country, and he briefed just about everyone. There are lots of people he briefed, Premier of Ontario, to name just one, who have no reason to do anything nice to him. Yeah. And I think you have to give the government credit for that.
I mean, Andrew Scheer sort of veered into that last week. I don't know how successful it was, but yeah.
Yeah, but since the Prime Minister briefed the premiers,
nothing else.
It has been radio silence to the despair of some of us who thought they had good sources.
So that's right. That is true, actually. So what about, though, that moment where Chrystia Freeland finds herself in Europe doing various speeches, finds out there's an agreement or at least a handshake deal between Mexico and the U.S. and has to rush back? Is that an indication that they weren't, I don't know, that they weren't aware that it was that close? Or what does that tell us, if anything?
She's been on the file for a year and a half. I mean, there's days when she's going to be somewhere besides that that reporter's alley in Washington, and having to hop on a flight is not the worst. Shachi and I did it today, and it didn't kill us. We know this much. Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency, repeatedly calling NAFTA the worst deal in history. He didn't even say the worst trade deal. I mean, it was worse apparently than all the hockey trades in history. And a year and a half later, NAFTA is still the rule set by which trade is governed across North America. Churchill said there's nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result. It's not entirely exhilarating because we're still getting shot at. There's still some chance that the next bullet will hit, and that, this president, who's in the worst crisis week of his presidency, will decide that he needs to cancel NAFTA to change the channel. I mean, that's still a possibility. But for a year and a half, that trade deal has remained in place. It's not nothing.
So as I think about the next 13, 14 months and how all of this then plays out in front of the electorate, in many ways, notwithstanding maybe a foreign minister being perceived to be caught off guard, look at what's happened in Washington in the last week. Every time we think that the White House has punched its ticket to crazy town, it takes a detour to crazier town. All of that bodes very well for the Prime Minister. For him, at the end of the day, I suspect that selling this deal may be more important to Canadians and the way he sells it than the actual substance of it. We gave on this, we got on that. That will end up taking a backseat to being able to say, I fought Trump, I stood up to him. I demonstrated that I was swinging for the fences. And on things like dispute resolution, when he says, look, we can't trust Trump, therefore we need these things, we need that red line, that is a resonant message.
But if the reason that we keep NAFTA is because somebody took a piece of paper off the president's desk when he wanted to rip it up, I mean, how much credit then can you take?
But that is like saying, should we also feel guilty because the president is acting irrationally? We have a government that is negotiating with people who are not, we can't vouch that they're seriously negotiating much of anything, and who are in a crisis. It's their crisis, not ours.
And we're in a relatively, we have to remind ourselves, we're in a relatively strong position in a couple of ways. One is that Trump himself cannot simply snap his fingers and cancel.
It's not all
go through the Congress. So we've got power in Washington. Secondly, we traded with the Americans for 120 years before there was a free trade agreement. We would still trade with them after a NAFTA. We just wouldn't trade as efficiently. So it's not the end of the world, even if the worst case happens and NAFTA gets torn up. We would still survive as a country.
Okay, I want to switch gears before I run out of time to pipelines, because that was the other part of what I think everyone was agreed was a bad week for the Trudeau government. I'm not sure it was the worst week, but certainly a very challenging one. What do they do next here, Paul? Because they have not only a lot of money, our money, riding on this, but a lot of political capital too, and they do seem to be, I don't know, stuck for now anyway.
Yeah. Well, as regards the court decision that was so upsetting for them, they've got a few options, and there's actually nothing to stop them from pursuing every option at once. They can appeal to the Supreme Court. They can come up with a sort of legislative patch to try and kick the approval process forward. And they can throw together an expedited but slightly more serious consultation and environmental assessment process. And as I say, they can do all of those at once.
That's a good point.
But in the meantime, this grand bargain that was at the center of the Trudeau political offer in 2015, we can do energy exports and the environment. We can be better at both, and there don't have to be any losers. It's starting to look like that's not the case. That people who are against pipelines don't accept that you cancel two pipelines and then pass a third. And the coalition against serious climate change action is growing.
Or it's just much harder to do than they expected.
Yeah, well, but you could argue that in the case of the grand bargain, it was already in trouble before that court ruling on Trans Mountain with the BC government that doesn't want the pipeline, and an Ontario government that doesn't want the carbon pricing. So once you've got those two big pieces, and they're not small, you can't say this court decision suddenly is making it unravel. I understand Alberta's decision to say, if this isn't going to work out, we're going to pull out, but it has no impact. The real test of this in Alberta is the Alberta election. And everyone's known that for months. Now, Paul is right, they can do all these things at the same time, but what they can't do is find a magic solution that will, wave a magic wand and this problem will go away. And you read a lot of that. It does not exist. I'd be wary of going to the Supreme Court because if the Supreme Court refuses to hear the appeal, that basically says what was said in federal court stands.
And I would bet dollars and donuts they would uphold it. If you read that ruling, it's absolutely couched in language of previous Supreme Court rulings.
Yes.
It seems to me highly unlikely the court would see differently, but you never know. Look, this was in trouble. The grand bargain was in trouble before this court ruling. The court ruling arguably, makes things better for them by emphasizing the rule of law and keeping everybody sort of within that.
And suggesting solutions.
Yeah. So exactly. I don't think it's the setback that some people have said. But the grand bargain required that you handle each side of that bargain extremely well. And I wouldn't say that they've handled either the pipeline or the carbon pricing, the politics of either of those terribly well.
Okay, last word to you, then I'll take a break.
Particularly on the issue of trying to keep that pipeline completion on track, that ruling very clearly gets back to the heart of the matter, which is a lack of consultation on tankers. And when you talk about a path to yes, when you talk about how to get those people there's always going to be a core that's opposed no matter what. But when you look at British Columbia, when you look at the rest of the country, when you say, you know what, if they could find a better way to reassure people on the issue of tankers off the West Coast, there is a real coming down in temperature in terms of the heat of that opposition. And I've said this all along, it is a tanker issue. So look, today we hear that boost to funding on spill response off the coast of BC is on hold. If I was government, I wouldn't do that. I'd go ahead and say, look, we're demonstrating what we need to do to get to a yes on that.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Andrew, Chantal, Shachi, and Paul will be back for another round of At Issue. We're going to check in with the other party. Stick around.